Friends, would you please join with me in the spirit of prayer? Renewing, restoring God, move in our midst this morning in the same way that the woman ministered to Jesus centuries ago, that the truth of her love might be made real in our presence and encountered here and now for the living out of every day this week. In the name of faithful women throughout the centuries who have provided and continue to provide and uplift the ministry of this church, Jesus the Christ we pray. Amen. So scattered throughout my daily life are these moments when my less than brilliant self shows up and I do something rather boneheaded. I'm thinking here about a moment when I start waving at someone only to realize I don't know them. Or a moment maybe when a waiter sets down a plate of food in front of me and says, "Enjoy your meal." And I look back at him earnestly and say, "You too." These awkward moments. But awkward moments don't only happen here and now in the midst of our lives, they also happened then and there in the midst of Jesus' life. The scripture reading you just heard Nancy offer to us this morning, this beautiful, intimate scene, also has some awkwardness baked into it. The premise is rather straightforward and simple. A Pharisee has invited Jesus over for a meal. Now, in Jesus' day, when you invited a special guest to your house, word would kind of travel along the communal grapevine, and it was customary for a crowd to congregate outside so that they could hear and they could see everything that was going on inside. Can you imagine throwing a dinner party and having people outside milling about? But that's what would happen. And one of those people in the crowd, a woman, slipped in silently through a side door just over there. Now, in Jesus' day, it was customary for people not to really notice women as the beloved child and daughters of God that they truly were and are. If this woman even got the glance or the glimpse of anyone in that room that day, I dare say that they probably just assumed she was a servant. That the same way Mary assumes that Jesus is a gardener on the very first Easter. This woman who had slipped stealthily into the room and starts to blend in with the crowd. But when the appointed time comes, they all congregate, all the important invited guests congregate around the table. Now, it's not a dining room table like you or I might have where we sit perched up. In Jesus' day, you dined reclining. The table was low to the ground. And there were pillows that were scattered around. And so you'd kind of lean on one elbow with your face toward the food so you could eat. And your feet would be sort of tucked behind you where you couldn't see them. Imagine your body in the shape of an S. That's how Jesus and the others were sitting around this meal that the Pharisee had prepared that day, talking and sharing with one another. Until the woman who had stealthily came into the room, comes up behind Jesus, begins to wash his feet with her tears. She lets down her hair and begins to dry them. His feet, his dusty, dirty feet with her hair. It is not only an intimate scene. If you would have been there in that room, I think you would have sensed the awkwardness in the air. if you don't hold this passage at a distance, bring it in a little closer. Hold it up to your ear. I think you can hear people the way they sometimes still do, when we get uncomfortable, we cough, right? Or maybe if you're holding it close, you can hear somebody at the dinner table next to Jesus saying, look behind you, Jesus. Look behind you. The awkwardness that hung in the air. But there's also a scandal that's going on here. In Jesus' day, women and men did not interact. For a public venue like that meal, for the woman and Jesus to be in such close proximity, that's an automatic R rating to the movie version. And then the fact that she touches his feet in public, NC-17, and people posting on Facebook, won't somebody think about the children? This, my friends, is scandalous, but there's a sacredness to it. There is trouble. Right there in River City with a capital T, that stands for tears. But they could also stand for the tenacity that this woman embodies. It could stand for her tenderness that she exhibits and lets flow through her in ministry to Jesus. What you heard this morning is nothing other than what scholars call the gospel in miniature. In 17 short verses, we get the Cliff Notes version of what Jesus' whole ministry is about. If you don't want to read an entire gospel, just reread this one sacred, scandalous, tenacious, tender scene. What Jesus is about in throughout all of Scriptures is seeing God's presence, God's image in each and every person. Seeing that light of God that burns brightly in us all. Inviting that, encouraging that. I love that question in the middle part of the passage where Jesus asks, do you see this woman? Isn't that a great question? Notice how the Pharisee doesn't answer, right? It's all awkward. Do you see this woman? Because Jesus sees her. Sees her as a beloved daughter of God. The spotlight is so bright, not only on the woman, but also on this Pharisee who's hosting the meal. And I think oftentimes we've sort of been trained and we get trapped into looking down our noses at Pharisees. But Pharisees were faithful in Jesus' day. Pharisees wanted to reform the church. Have you ever looked around this church, this ministry, and thought to yourself, there's some few things we could improve around here? That's part of that Pharisee tradition, wanting to reform the faith. They wanted to reform it because, on the one hand, another branch of the Jewish tradition at that time were the Sadducees. And they had sort of gotten caught up in the Roman ruling elite and the power that came with it. And at the other end of the Jewish tree, there were the Essenes. And they wanted nothing to do with any of that, and so they went off into the desert to live as Moses lived in the wilderness. But the Pharisees didn't want to live at either one of those extremes. They wanted to live in the messy middle of the reality of Roman oppression and life, and God still creating presence. Live in the messy middle of life. It's where I find myself. And so it's not unusual sometimes for me to find myself relating to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees sought to live in that messiness by clinging to the 600 plus laws that are laid out in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. You see, in the midst of ambiguity, In the midst of uncertainty, those laws gave them something that they felt like they could stand on. And when I look at the Pharisees that way, it speaks to me. But not only that, I love how in this story, as Luke unfolds it for us, that we also get to hear the inner monologue of this Pharisee, right? He's surveying the scene, and he makes two assumptions. One, he looks at the woman bathing Jesus' feet, drying the feet with her hair, and declares that she's a sinner. And second, he thinks, if Jesus was worth his weight in salt, if he's really this great prophet that everybody's talking about, he'd know who's touching her and he'd stop it. So last week, choir, remember last week, I asked you all to write down some questions this week. That questions are a vital part of a vibrant faith. We've spent a week dealing with that. As I was sitting with this story, one of the questions I came up with was, what if Jesus could hear my internal monologue as I survey this world? And I thought waving at strangers was awkward. Have Jesus know what's going on in my mind, in my heart, in my soul? And Jesus cuts through all of this by telling a very straightforward and simple story. It's a story that would have been familiar to everyone, especially to that crowd that had congregated outside and were sort of eavesdropping on the conversation. It was a story about debt. And it's a story about two people. One owed 50 denarii. That's about 50 days worth of your labor. Another owed 500. Over a year and a half of that person's labor. And in an instant, both debts are forgiven. And Jesus asked the question, who would love the person who forgave more? It's a great story. But I think it also opens us up to this understanding that sometimes within our faith, we turn this understanding of God's grace, of God's love, of God's presence into a transaction rather than an invitation to transformation. I mean, it's easy to do. We swim in this cultural waters of consumerism. We're constantly being invited to exchange our cash, our credit cards, our checks in return for food or for goods or for services. And that economic way of being has a tendency to creep and to crawl into our understandings of church. One of the questions that I sit with when I think about this passage is, are there ways that I turn my relationship with God into a transaction rather than an invitation to transformation? It's a tough question. It's one of those big questions to get my mind wrapped around. But it's easy to do. I do that kind of transaction relationship work in my life. For example, with my children, I tell them that as long as they are living underneath my roof, they will pick their dirty socks up off the floor. That's a transactional way of dealing with them. And I can stand here before you and honestly say, it doesn't lead to much transformation. So can you hold on to that question? Are there ways in which we're still living a relationship with God or with each other and viewing it through the lens of transaction rather than an invitation to transformation? You see, that's what we see in this passage. A Pharisee who thought, if I keep all 600 laws, I'll be in right relationship with God. And a woman whose love could not be contained, and it poured forth from her literally in tears. Transaction, transformation. That invitation for us in the midst of our lives, to let the embodiment of this woman, her loving ministry to Jesus, not be something that happened then and there 2,000 years ago, but that still happens today. That you and I can still get caught up in. This understanding of transaction and transformation, I know it's tough for me to get my head wrapped around. And so I want to offer to you something very practical. I was trying to figure out, how do I help offer this understanding to you in a way that you can hold on to? And this comes from one of our members who sent this to me toward the end of this week, and it was like a moment of God's grace pouring over me. It's a piece this person wrote entitled Water. Just a plain old tumbler of water from the kitchen sink. As I stood there with it shimmering in my hand, across my mind flashed the recycling plan of evaporation, condensation, flowing rivers of water. And suddenly I wondered, did I hold in my hands some of the water parted in the Red Sea? Was this the water on which Jesus walked? Or did it flow down from the Jordan stream when those immortal words echoed, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased"? Would I discover in this glass some of that water through which pilgrim boots waded at Plymouth Harbor 3,000 years ago? How many soldiers of how many nations had crossed through it on their way to victory or crashed in defeat? Was there within it the first drink of a newborn child, or the last cooling comfort for parched, dying lips? I could never know what forces and history and drama now gave my life the refreshing touch. And suddenly I knew in this life neither would I ever truly know those forces that gave me life and molded me for service and allowed me to bring refreshment to others. So every time, each time this week, you hold in your hand a refreshing drink of water. Remember God's refreshing presence in your life. Remember that call to embody the scandalous love of the woman centuries ago, and that might be good news for such a time as this.